to allow more people to join. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining When to Lead and When to Follow with Professor Susan Herman, Carl Forbes Jr., and Desiree Alexander. I'm Lanier Hutchison, the Vice President of the Association of Black Women Attorneys, and I have the honor in presenting tonight's presenter and moderators. Professor Susan Herman is the inaugural Ruth Bader Ginsburg Professor of Law. Like Ginsburg, she served as General Counsel to the American Civil Liberties Union. In October 2008, Herman was elected as the 7th president of the ACLU, a position she held until stepping down this past January. She teaches courses in constitutional law and criminal law and seminars including law and literature, terrorism and civil liberties, and the recent COVID-19 and the Constitution. A highly regarded authority on constitutional and criminal procedure topics, she is a prolific author in these areas. Her extensive writings have been published in scholarly and other publications, ranging from law reviews and books to periodicals and online publications. Her most recent book, Taking Liberties, The War on Terror and the Erosion of American Democracy, was awarded by the 2012 Royce C. Palmer Civil Liberties Prize. She is also the co-author of Terrorism, Government and Law, National Authority and Local Autonomy, and the War on Terrorism. Professor Herman has discussed constitutional law issues on radio and television, including NPR, CNN, C-SPAN, NBC, MSNBC, and PBS. Her opinions are frequently published in leading print media. She has been a frequent speaker at academic conferences and continuing legal education events organized by groups such as the Federal Judicial Center and the American Bar Association, and has lectured and conducted workshops for various groups of judges and lawyers, including us tonight. She has also spoken before non-legal groups, including the U.S. Army War College and other schools, and at international conferences such as the Web Summit and Collision. She has participated in U.S. Supreme Court litigation, writing and collaborating on Supreme Court amicus briefs for the ACLU on a range of constitutional criminal procedure issues, most recently in the case of Riley v. California. Professor Herman received her BA from Barnard College and JD from New York University for New York University School of Law, where she was a note and comment editor on the NYU Law Review. Before entering teaching, she served as pro se law clerk for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and Associate Director of Prisoners Legal Service of New York. She has received awards in honoring her accomplishments from Barnard College, Brooklyn Law School, NYU Law, and Trinity College, and from numerous organizations, including Crane's New York Business, the Japanese American Bar Association, and the Coalition of Women Initiatives in Law. Welcome, Professor Herman. Carl Forbes Jr. is the founder and principal attorney of Carl Forbes Jr. Law Firm, PLLC, a general service New York law firm with an emphasis on real estate, estate planning, probate and estate administration, and estate litigation. Carl is the president-elect of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. He is an adjunct professor of law at New York Law School, where he co-teaches pretrial advocacy and negotiating, counseling, and interviewing. He is also an experienced real estate investor and licensed real estate broker. Carl has been rated as New York Metro Rising Star by Super Lawyers 2019 to 2021, selected to the 2021 National Black Lawyers Top 100 list, and recognized as 2016 and 2017 Empire State Counsel by the New York State Bar Association for his commitment to pro bono legal work. Carl received his BA in Philosophy, Politics, and Law from Binghamton University and his JD from Columbia Law School, where he was a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar. Carl also previously worked as Special Counsel Corporation in the Office of Corporate Counsel, New York City Law Department. He worked in the Brooklyn Tort Division, where he defended the city of New York in personal injury, property damage, and police matters. Thank you for co-hosting tonight, Carl. Desiree Alexander graduated from St. John's University for her undergraduate degree and then attended Brooklyn Law School for her law degree, where she was both a faculty mentee of constitutional law and teaching assistant for Professor Susan Herman. Desiree is also a full-time back-to-back trial attorney for the New York City Law Department. In her spare time, she serves her community as board member of the Association of Black Women Attorneys, a mock trial coach at Brooklyn Law School, and a member of Go On Girl Book Club. Desiree is also the owner and founder of The Lit Auntie, a content space dedicated to inspiring women to live a passion-filled life instead of one obsessed with finding love. Her content includes merchandise, social media posts, Clubhouse app conversation, blog posts, virtual bonding events, and many more. Thank you so much to our moderators tonight, Desiree and Carl. Desiree, I'll pass it along to you.
Thank you so much, Lanier. I really appreciate it. And I am super excited for the program that we have for you all tonight. So tonight, as you all know, it's entitled When to Lead and When to Follow. We're going to be discussing the history of the leadership and work of the ACLU. So who better than this immediate past president and my former professor, Susan Herman, to talk to us about just that. So tonight we're going to be covering topics about the formation of the ACLU, its history, its purpose. Also, we're going to hear about Susan Herman's work with the ACLU and her leadership as president. And two topics that I think is really going to be highlighted and I'm excited to hear about is really that aspect of women in leadership, as well as the racial justice component. So when we have all of these intersectional issues, it'll be interesting to see just in particular with an organization like the ACLU, precisely when we should be leading and when we should be following. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Susan Herman to begin her presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Desiree, and thank you, Lanier, for the lovely introductions. And I have to say, it has been such a kick to be planning this program with Desiree and with other dear former students like Antis Cecilia Green and Jennifer Taiwe, who is going to be with us as soon as she finishes her meeting with some people from New Zealand. And I also see Moya O'Connor in the house, another former student. Hi, Moya. So we have a lot of interesting different perspectives here. And I thought that what Desiree was saying is that one of the themes I think that I want to be raising tonight that we can all then talk about together is the theme about building diversity and inclusion. And I'm going to, somebody needs to mute. Okay, so yeah, so building diversity and inclusion, and I'm not so much going to be talking about the ACLU to tell you about the ACLU, although that'll be there, is I want to give you an example of how the ACLU grew into more diverse leadership as well as more diverse work over the 101 years of its existence. And so I'm going to talk both internally about the staff and the leadership and how that's changed over time and how that happened. And I'm also going to be talking some about the growth of the ACLU's work, and how that's changed over time and how it makes a difference, who's actually doing the work. And then the second theme, what Desiree is saying, the how to lead, how to follow, I think is also a discussion that we can have about how you defend civil liberties and civil rights. How do you find allies? What kind of coalitions can you build? And what can you do as individuals, even if it's not your day job to be working at a place like the ACLU or the NAACP? So I'm going to share my screen now so I can be showing you some pictures. There's not going to be a quiz here, but that's the title side. And this is logos of the ACLU over 100 years. We had our centennial last year. And this is 100 different years of logos. And so I'm going to start by telling you a story of gender. And then later on, I'm going to tell you a story about race. But why it's a good idea in the ACLU's history to me starts with this woman, Crystal Eastman, one of the most amazing women you've probably never heard of. And it was Crystal Eastman who dreamed up the idea of a civil liberties organization. And I think it would be fair to say she kind of dreamed up the idea of civil liberties. And the way that this came about was that Crystal Eastman graduated from law school in 1907 and couldn't get a job because she was a woman, right? And who was going to hire a woman out of a law, at a law firm or any place else? So she was pretty good at coming up with Plan B. So what she did instead was she worked on a study of industrial accidents and ended up drafting the country's first workers' compensation law, which New York State adopted. So that was a pretty good Plan B. But the other thing that Crystal Eastman did, because she couldn't really have a day job, there wasn't any place like the ACLU or the NAACP that was kind of an organization like that. But she became involved with and was the head of any number of organizations having to do with suffrage and pacifism. She was a great internationalist. And she, not that many of her counterparts, was also a socialist. And I think that one thing that is very impressive to me about women at the beginning of the 20th century was that they really figured out how to build organizations and use the power of organizations because they didn't have political power. They mostly couldn't vote. Women couldn't vote until 1920 when the 19th Amendment was adopted, and they couldn't run for office. So Crystal was not the only woman who was involved in founding the ACLU. There were other women who were suffragists and social workers and famous people like that. But the way in which Crystal ended up having the idea of the Civil Liberties Bureau is that she was the head of an a pacifist organization, an anti-war organization called the American Union Against Militarism. And they were fighting the entry of the United States into World War I. They were fighting the war altogether. They were fighting conscription. And this is an example of their organizing tactics. They had this big parade down Fifth Avenue, which starred the papier-mâché Jingo the dinosaur, showing you why war was so foolish. So they were full out involved in anti-war activities and did things like have a people-to-people delegation to Mexico, which is really largely credited with averting an American war with Mexico at about that time. So that's a whole other story. But what happened in 1917, when the United States did join World War I, was that it was no longer possible to just be acting and speaking against the war and against the draft. Crystal had a brother, Max Eastman, who was publishing a magazine, a kind of lefty arts and politics magazine called The Masses. And he and some other people were prosecuted for sedition. You weren't allowed to speak out against the war anymore. And Congress had passed this Sedition Act that actually made it a crime and meant that you could be prosecuted for speaking against the war or against the draft. So what Crystal figured out how to do was to pivot. She said, well, here's what we could do. We could start a National Civil Liberties Bureau. And we'll say, oh, no, we're not against the war. We're just for everybody's freedom of speech. And we're just representing conscientious objectors because they should have a right to make their own decisions. And we will just defend people who are being prosecuted for saying things that are unpopular, because that's what the First Amendment should mean. Now, at this time, the courts were not yet protecting the First Amendment in a way that we've become accustomed to. So it is sort of surprising that there were so many people who were actually prosecuted and ended up spending time in prison just for saying things that were considered to be unpatriotic. Another part of Crystal's experience, you may know that a lot of the suffragists, the people who were fighting for the 19th Amendment, were also arrested demonstrating out in front of the White House, and they had a pretty hard time of it. So one of the things that that came to her attention was the whole idea that maybe you could have this idea of civil liberties. So in 1917, the American Union Against Militarism did start a National Civil Liberties Bureau. However, by that point, a new person came in and became the head of the NCLB, and that was Roger Baldwin, who had been a social worker. And the reason that he moved in to take over the AUAM and then the National Civil Liberties Bureau was that Crystal went on maternity leave. Now, she went on maternity leave for like 5 minutes. She came back to work almost immediately thereafter. And at least at one point, she wasn't really that happy with the idea that she would be replaced as the leader of this organization that she had been running. I've seen a letter that she wrote to the chair of her board saying, well, really, my assistant could handle things while I'm gone, and then I'll be back really soon. So you don't really need to bring somebody else in. But in fact, Roger Baldwin came in and he ended up being, having the position at the head. And then for various reasons, Crystal had health issues and she was doing a lot of other things. So by the time in 1920 that Roger Baldwin then converted the National Civil Liberties Bureau into the ACLU, that's the founding of the ACLU, Crystal was really marginalized. she was on the executive committee of the ACLU for a little while, and then sort of walked away after not very long. So it's a kind of a story that's pretty familiar, right? The woman who's doing all these things ends up kind of in the margins while a man takes over. So Roger Baldwin was a very talented person. He was the first executive director of the ACLU from 1920 until 1950, and his legend looms large. The first council of the ACLU, this is Arthur Garfield Hayes. If any of you went to NYU, you know that there's an Arthur Garfield Hayes Civil Liberties program, even though Carl, he actually went to Columbia. And this is what the ACLU did at the beginning, because at the beginning, you could not count on going into the courts and saying that violates the First Amendment. So Baldwin and Hayes would go out and do public speaking to try to explain about civil liberties and what was wrong with prosecuting people for saying what they thought, even if it was unpopular. And then they were also defying laws that they thought limited freedom of association. So one of the things that I think they both liked to do was to kind of get up on the car, where they weren't supposed to be having an assembly to begin with, or a meeting. And then when they were arrested, they wanted to be arrested for an illegal assembly for reading out the words of the First Amendment. So they would read the First Amendment and then get arrested for that. And they thought that that was pretty good publicity. So there were some really very interesting men who were running the ACLU. However, what was happening to the women? Well, Roger Baldwin, going back to him for a minute, said that the early ACLU was really kept afloat by women. So I showed you before, Jeanette Rankin, who was the first woman to be elected to Congress, was the first vice president of the ACLU. And Roger Baldwin said, well, women really kept the ACLU afloat by doing all the committee work and all the fundraising. Sound familiar? Meanwhile, who's running the organization itself? Who has the day jobs, not on the board, but on the staff? It's Roger Baldwin and it's Arthur Garfield Hayes. It's men. Now, one thing that I think is that if Crystal Eastman had not gone on maternity leave and if her health had been better, she might have become the first executive director of the ACLU. And I think then things might have been quite different. I think the ACLU might have been doing women's rights work from the very beginning in 1920, because Crystal is the person who co-wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, she and Alice Paul. In 1920, when the 19th Amendment was adopted, a lot of the women's groups were celebrating and saying, this is great, we've won, now we have the right to vote. Crystal gave a very famous speech. It's still on the register of the American Rhetoric Society's list of the 100 greatest American speeches of all time. And her speech was called, Now We Can Begin. So her idea is that getting the political power was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of a real fight for women's equality. Now, you know what happened to the Equal Rights Amendment. It never was adopted. And today, the bottom left here, the Congress has just been talking about legislation to allow the time for ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment to continue, so it would still have a chance of being ratified. But what's interesting to me is that the ACLU did not support the Equal Rights Amendment. If Crystal had been the leader, again, things might have been different. But the reason the ACLU did not support the Equal Rights Amendment and was not immediately fighting for women's equality is that many of the women's groups at the time disagreed with Crystal, and they did not want to fight for full equality for women because they were afraid that that would mean that they would lose the benefit of protectionist legislation, the special law that protected women that had been very hard won. So they had fought for all these special protections. Women can't be forced to work more than a certain number of hours a day, certain advantages. So what was interesting was that at the beginning, again, the ACLU was not doing women's rights work. And that didn't really change until the 1960s and early 70s. And that was due to two women who were on the ACLU board. So for those of you who think about your careers and different ways to do things like promoting civil liberties, civil rights, one way is it can be your day job, but the other way is it can be you can be on the board of something. You don't necessarily have to be on the staff. So Dorothy Kenyon was a judge, and Dorothy Kenyon was on the board of the ACLU from 1930 until her death in 1972. And she really pushed the ACLU to support the Equal Pay Act, which was signed in 1963, and to get more involved in women's rights work. In the 1960s, she was joined by Polly Murray, who joined the board in 1965. Now, if you haven't heard of Polly Murray, she's recently getting more attention, but she was an amazing civil rights activist. She had been a minister and was just an amazing person. She had great groundbreaking ideas about equality. And Desiree, I think you were Lanier, just using the word intersectional. People think intersectionality is this idea that's just recently happened. Well, the word may have recently happened, but Polly Murray was an intersectionalist. One of the things she used to say was, how come everybody only talks about Jim Crow? How come they don't talk about Jane Crow? So she was extremely interested in, what about the women? So these members of the board of the ACLU pushed the ACLU to get more involved in women's rights work. And there, who's about to enter the picture, right, in 1972, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the notorious RBG herself. That is, I have the honor these days of being the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School. So I took a field trip to see the statue of RBG, which has just been put up at City Point. So if you go on Flatbush Avenue to the Flatbush Avenue at City Point, right inside the door there, you'll see this great statue of RBG, which they have not fenced off so that everybody can do the photo opportunity. So I did mine. Of course, you noticed the masks that a friend gave me with the I dissent and the lace collar and all. But there were, teenage girls having their pictures taken and all. So, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has become an icon. So you all know that the other thing I want to mention is that Ginsburg was not on the staff of the ACLU. She was teaching at Rutgers. And so she started the project. She was the co-founder while she had a day job. She's teaching and doing her day job and bringing all these incredible cases, string of cases in the Supreme Court, most of which she won. Was a brilliant strategist, including figuring out that sometimes you had to represent men to convince the 9 old white men on the Supreme Court that gender stereotyping might be bad for men too. But one thing I want to tell you is that Ginsburg did not want to take full credit for the work that she did. So the first brief that she wrote on behalf of the ACLU in the Supreme Court, she put the names of Dorothy Kenyon and Polly Murray on the front of the brief, even though they had not worked on the case, just to signal that she was standing on their shoulders, that she was doing work that they had really paved the way for. So the ACLU is now, we have a women's rights project still. One person, actually one of the former directors, referred to it as the house that Ruth built. Now, if you're a baseball fan, you may know that that was a nickname for Yankee Stadium and that the Ruth referred to there as Babe Ruth. I think Justice Ginsburg would have liked being thought of as a babe. But here is the current director of the Women's Rights Project, Ria Tobacco-Mar. And Ria came to the Women's Rights Project after having been a staff attorney at the ACLU's LGBT project. And so, you can also tell, I think her family was from Mexico. So, she is herself fairly intersectional in a way that the ACLU really believes in a whole range of rights and liberties and how they all fit together. And it's wonderful that she has had a chance to interact with Justice Ginsburg herself. So these days, the ACLU is doing a whole lot of work on things like trying to get better pregnancy discrimination protection. There's still a lot of work to be done on the equal pay front. And one current lawsuit that I think would have been right up Ruth Bader Ginsburg's alley is a case that's called National Coalition for Men Against Selective Service System. And what this case says is that the Supreme Court in the early 1980s held that the United States does not deny equal protection by requiring only men to register for the draft and not women. And their reason at the time, the Supreme Court's reason, was that women and men were not similarly situated because women were not eligible to serve in combat. And if there were a draft, you would primarily need combat troops. And therefore, why should you have to have the women register too? Well, a few decades have passed since then. And partially due to a lawsuit that was brought by the Women's Rights Project and another similar lawsuit, women are now allowed in combat. So that was another lawsuit of, how come women aren't allowed in combat? And there were all sorts of women who had been doing, flying medical evacuation helicopters and getting shot at, but they couldn't advance in their careers because technically they were not allowed to be in combat. So the Department of Defense caved and they said, okay, we're going to have all the services make up rules now for how what jobs women can do as part of combat. So this is a cert petition. The Court of Appeals said, well, we can't overrule the Supreme Court's earlier decision. So that's to the Supreme Court. And I just saw today that the Biden administration, after stalling a long time, they asked for a number of extensions before taking a position on whether or not the Supreme Court should grant cert. And what they decided to do was to ask the Supreme Court to stall, to wait, because they said there's a commission considering this and Congress is kind of in the process of thinking about this issue again. So they wanted Congress to be given a chance to do that. So women, unless you age out, it may well be that very soon Congress is going to say that you should be treated equally, and that women as well as men do have to register for the draft. So if anybody's going to do it, everybody should do it. So there's a lot more work that the Women's Rights Project is doing now, but I think it's an interesting progression from the women who are kind of formally involved with the ACLU and doing work behind the scenes to the current ACLU, where the staff of the national ACLU and of our 54 affiliates around the country is either 50% or over, like 60% or even more women. So half the staff are women. We have about half of the executive directors of the affiliates are women. We have not yet had a woman as executive director or legal director. That's Anthony Romero and David Cole, but we now have our third woman president. I was the second woman president after Nadine Strawson, and the current president, who I handed the gavel over to at the on January 31st, is Deborah Archer, who is a clinical professor at NYU Law School. So we've had a bunch of the last 4 presidents have been constitutional law professors from New York.
And so Professor Herman,
yeah, so I'm going to stop there. And Desiree, go ahead.
Awesome. So I have just a really basic question to start off with. So we were looking at the slides of the last few presidents. Can you tell us what is the role of the president of the ACLU? What are you supposed to be doing?
Okay, so it's a great question because not everybody knows that. And I think you probably know that if you look at an organization and they have a title like president, you don't really know what that means until you find out, because some organizations, the president is the one who does the day job. They're really what we call the executive director. And in other places, as at the ACLU, being president means I chair the board.
Okay.
So I'm sure everybody knows that a not-for-profit, you have the board that decides the mission of the organization and sets the budget and hires the executive director, who then, as we call it, who then hires the staff. And they're the ones who do the day-to-day work. So the day-to-day work of the ACLU in the past 4 years has been over 400 lawsuits against the Trump administration. The travel ban, family separation, being as mean as you can to trans people, et cetera, et cetera. Plus over 100 lawsuits about COVID-related things once the pandemic had started. There were a whole bunch of lawsuits about how do you have a fair election in the middle of a pandemic, what should the election rules be. There were a whole lot of lawsuits about giving some relief to people who were detained in prisons and jails and in immigration detention, which were just hotbeds. Yeah, you can't socially distance. A lot of the people there didn't have enough soap to sing happy birthday even once. So, there are people all over the country working on this litigation. And just to give you a sense of, how much of an emergency this was on top of all the Trump related stuff. So I got an email about a jail litigation, I think in Ohio, that was, here's what's happening and here's what we want, and they're releasing these people. And the email was from an LGBT project attorney in New York. So it was kind of all hands on deck. Plus, you can imagine that the staff, like everyone else, was working remotely. So that means you're planning all this litigation while you're juggling a toddler and a cat, right? And then comes George Floyd, and just incredible amounts of work around protest around the country, and this new opportunity to think about racial justice. So the staff has been incredibly busy. But what's strange about being on the board is that you're not actually doing the work, that you're keeping the ship steady while the work is being done. And just keeping an eye on, one of the things that I kept an eye on was the ACLU's tradition is to be nonpartisan. And it was really hard during the Trump era to know what nonpartisanship meant. Yeah. Ordinarily, we like to reach across the aisle. Right. And there are places where there's this organization called Right on Crime, which includes the Koch brothers and all, and they're really into sentencing reform. Mm-hmm. So, we partner with them. and there are places, we agree across the aisles with people, and we've always wanted to have that opportunity. But again, the nonpartisanship was hard. So one of the biggest things that I did as president was I led a process to really think about governance reform. Nobody had looked at the ACLU structure of how we organize ourselves internally for 50 years before I became president. So I wrote a transition memo and I said, I think we should be doing this. We had 54 affiliates, and our board of directors at the time was over 80 people because we had a representative of each affiliate plus some at-large representatives. Now, try making a decision in a group of 80 people. Okay, so we ended up at the end, we were considering whether or not we really needed to have every affiliate represented on the board all the time. And so we ended up not really changing the representation structure, but we did shrink the size of the board somewhat. And we also ended up having an executive committee that was kind of more empowered, that actually now adopts the budget. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that I did as president.
So Professor Herman, you touched on something about governance that I think is a good segue to a question I have for you. I find it interesting that despite the role being more chair of the board than executive director, there have only been 8 presidents in the 101-year history of the organization, and Deborah Archer is the first Black person to serve as president. You talk a bit about what that says about the organization?
Yeah, I think one thing that it says about the organization is that it took a lot of work to get to the point where we are now. So I was telling you about the statistics about women, that right now the staff, the boards, the national and affiliate boards are half women or over half women. The other thing I can tell you, Carl, is that at the present, the ACLU's national board is 60% of people who identify as non-white. Okay, now that was quite a process, and it took a lot of work. It took organizational policies that required the affiliates not only to say, let's send us the same white guys as representatives. We had to kind of push them to do it. Don't keep sending us the same person. You have to, and then we would set on certain goals and timetables and rules for them. So that's part of how that happened. Now, the other way that this happened is I think that in a way, Deborah's work paved the room for herself, because when I was elected president, one of the jobs that we have in order to keep an eye on how well the affiliates were able to work with the timetables and the goals that we had was that when affiliates would hire an executive director, which is their most important decision, because the executive director then hires everybody else. A lot of them were having a really hard time with attracting any different candidates from the people they were used to, kind of white men or white women. And I thought, I saw enough of this to think, well, they're making some mistakes in how they're going about this. So for example, one thing that they would do is in issuing a job description, they would say civil experience with civil liberties desirable. Okay, so if you're saying, okay, having worked for a civil liberties organization is going to give you a leg up, you're going to get the same pool of people. You're not going to get a more diverse people. Where do you send the job announcements to? Just how do you do this? So Deborah at the time in 2008, when I became president, was running a racial justice institute at New York Law School. And so I said to her, I said, would you take on the job of being the national equity officer for the affiliates? I said to her, if the ACLU can't get this right, what hope is there for the rest of the country? And so I said, so if you can work with them and explain to them where they're going wrong, if we can figure this out, maybe, by doing it right, maybe we're a model, maybe we can figure this out. And Deborah just did amazing work for 12 years. Every time there was a vacancy in an affiliate, she would work with the affiliate of, okay, let's look at the job description. Who are you talking to? Who are your finalists? And one of the things that they were dealing with, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this happen, an organization will say, we want to have, we're very interested in diversity. We want a very open pool. So then they select the finalists, and there are 3 finalists and 2 are white and 1 isn't. And what do you know? They keep selecting the white person. Mm-hmm. So, the diverse person was the finalist. And it's like, look, we did so well. And so we also looked at, well, why does that happen? And so I think that the proof of the success of that is in the numbers. We now have, I can't tell you, the number changes every day, but we have at least, when I became president, we had 1 executive director of an affiliate in Hawaii who was a non-white person, Vanessa Chong. And now there are at least 7 or 8 Black women who are the heads of affiliates, all over the place, some in the South, some not. at least one Black man, and other people too. Amal Sinha in New Jersey, just much more diverse group of people. So I think it would be fair to say that I saw there was a question coming up in the chat that I didn't read all of, but in terms of the early ACLU, the ACLU was basically white people in the organization. And so this was not a direct, nobody was excluding Black people from the organization. Because the question is asking about Black women being excluded from suffrage rallies and parades, which is absolutely right. Even Alice Paul, who was so progressive, thought that it would set back the cause of suffrage if you kind of rubbed in the faces of the southern states that by enabling women to vote, they were going to enable Black women to vote, and that wouldn't be something that they would like. And so there was a lot of controversy about that. It's very difficult history. So I think, I would like actually to talk a little bit more about that history of race at the ACLU. So maybe I'll go back if you have anything else you want to talk about there. But I have some of this on a PowerPoint on this too.
Yeah, I think that's a good place.
I think that's a good segue for now, Carl. And again, if there's any question at any point, even if I'm showing a slide, just wave at me and I'd be happy to stop and talk about anything. But there's a second story about the ACLU's origin, which is not about the First Amendment, which is really about equality and due process. And one of the chief things that people talk about all the time are the Palmer raids, which was in 1919, just as the ACLU was in formation. This was the case where the Attorney General, there was a bomb that was set off near the Attorney General's house, Mitchell Palmer. And so he ended up arresting all the usual suspects. You can see here 4,500 people, right? And they're deporting all the hundreds of people who did nothing wrong except that they are Eastern European or sometimes Italians, because the Italians were believed to be anarchists. A lot of them were mistreated in prison, and it was really pretty awful. It was just so xenophobic. And so the years after the World War I were really horribly xenophobic. So one of the first things that the ACLU did after being formed was they started issuing pamphlets, which was what you did in those days. There was no social media, right? So they issued one pamphlet about why the First Amendment is important. They issued another report on what was wrong with the Palmer raids, the due process problems, the equality problems, and really it was kind of a model for more recent reports about what was unconstitutional. The early ACLU was also very attentive to issues about race. And one piece of history that people may not know about so much are the riots in Elaine, Arkansas, which were caused by a lot of Black people who were organizing to try to get free of some of the limitations of sharecropping. There were tenant organizers and farmers. And just, I won't go into all the details, look it up if you're interested. But it was a major thing that also happened. I think it was 1919. I think 1919. And so the ACLU was interested in responding to all those kinds of things. And they did in 1931. I think maybe I'll just go ahead and show you this. They also issued a pamphlet about Black justice, which was also something that they were very interested in doing. But Roger Baldwin, him again, was very interested in not trying to compete with the NAACP. So here's one other early thing that very interesting publication that was produced by the ACLU by William Pickens, an amazing piece called Lynching and Debt Slavery, kind of coming out of the Elaine, Arkansas riots. So Roger Baldwin's thought was that instead of competing with the NAACP, which was older than the ACLU, NAACP was formed in 1909, and the ACLU didn't come along until 1920. So his idea was that you should coordinate, and there were things that the NAACP would handle, and then the ACLU would kind of be backup for the NAACP. Well, in just looking to see who he had on the board, actually in preparation for talking to you all today, I looked up the history of the NAACP, and I was staggered to see that the founding leaders of the NAACP were white guys. Right? Did you know that? Isn't that interesting? So I think that the idea there, again, is probably to try to sell the idea of the NAACP to mainstream lawyers and to, kind of to the establishment. But, that was the beginning of the NAACP too. So we've all had to progress and kind of get better about who you include as leaders. The NAACP had a lot of different founders. many of whom were, of course, non-white, W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida Wells, as well as some other people. Jane Addams, who was a founder of the ACLU, was also a founder of the NAACP. In those days, it's like everybody was just shuffling around from organization to organization and changing hats. So the first Black man to become a real leader at the NAACP, I believe, was James Weldon Johnson, who became what was called executive secretary in 1920. And Roger Baldwin gave him a seat on the ACLU's board of directors. And ever since, after that, from then on, it was Roger Baldwin's decision that there should always be a representative of the NAACP on the ACLU board. So one of the people to follow up there was Thurgood Marshall, who was on the ACLU board from 1938 to 1946. So again, I think it would be a little misleading if you just looked at the actual work that the ACLU did during all those decades and said, oh, well, they weren't really doing that many cases in this area, because what they were really trying to do was to let the NAACP take the lead. And that gets into the kind of leading and following idea that we were talking about. So one of the really big cases that the ACLU did become involved in some ways was what's always called the Scottsboro Boys. Does everybody know about that? 9 teenage Black men who were accused of raping 2 white women on the train. And even though history tells us that it was just trumped up charges, it was just not true. But there were 140 jurors in Alabama who found them guilty every time. Didn't matter how bad the evidence was. So the NAACP and the ACLU were both watching these cases a lot and were both involved, but the defendants were actually represented by the Communist Party, because it was the Communist Party that ended up approaching the families and convincing them that that this was about capitalism as well as everything else, and that the communist leadership was the best suited to be able to represent the defendants in this case. May or may not have been true. The ACLU ended up doing a lot of work on the litigation when the cases got to the Supreme Court. But I think that gives you some idea of the kind of the combination role here. Now, another interesting connection is this is Charles Garland, and he was this person who was the heir to a lot of money, and he was young, and he didn't want the money. He decided that it just it didn't feel right to him. He wanted to reject his inheritance. And Roger Baldwin talked to him, I'm sure other people talked to him too, and told him that instead of refusing the money, what he could do, that would be a really good thing to do, would be to set up a fund that could do nice progressive things. Well, Roger Baldwin was the leader of the trustees of that fund after Garland agreed to do that and set it up. And the Garland Fund became the bankroll for the school desegregation cases that led to Brown. So if you look at a lot of case books, they'll talk about the Garland Fund litigation. And Roger Baldwin was the person who was really steering the money to the NAACP and to the people who were doing the litigation about school desegregation. So it's another kind of interesting connection. And it's another thing in terms of how do you get the work done? Well, part of it is coalitions and figuring out who should do what. And part of it is just follow the money. Who's getting the money for you and what are they directing the money to? So when Brown versus Board of Education comes up, the ACLU wrote an amicus brief, and the brief says right at the beginning, it says, we're making the arguments that are not made in the main brief that you have. And look at who the brief is on behalf of. But it's not on behalf of the people, Linda Brown and the people who the NAACP was representing. It's, the Japanese American Citizens League, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, Unitarians. And the idea, of course, of an amicus brief is that Brown versus Board of Education is not only about the legacy of slavery. It's deeply about equality in this country in a lot of different ways. So when the Brown 2 came up the next year about how to enforce Brown, the ACLU specifically said, okay, we don't need to file a brief in this because we don't have anything really to say that hasn't already been said in the NAACP brief. So do you want to talk there, or should I talk forward a little bit about some of the racial justice work?
So
There's a question that just came into the chat asking for you to speak a little bit about the ACLU's representation of the KKK and how that history has impacted the relationship of the ACLU with the Black community.
Okay, that's a great question. I'm very glad you asked. Who asked that question?
Gail Wright.
Gail, hi Gail. Eleanor Holmes Norton, somebody had asked about before. Eleanor Holmes Norton was, she was a staff attorney, and I don't know if she was the first person on the national staff to be a Black woman, but knew she was. And one of the things that she loved to do, her bread and butter, was arguing First Amendment cases and arguing them on behalf of anybody. And she deeply believed that you can't have a First Amendment and kind of leave some things out. You know, there are some ideas that are just too bad that we won't represent them. In the 1930s, the ACLU published a pamphlet before World War II that was called something like why you should defend Nazi speech, right? And so the whole argument there is that if you say, well, you know, that speech is too nasty, we're just not going to defend those people's rights to say it, then you're back in World War I and in the sedition law, because everyone has different ideas about what's too nasty to say. And during World War I, what was too nasty to say was, you know, the draft is, you know, unconstitutional, or, you know, indentured servitude. And so the whole idea was that Eleanor Holmes Norton started was that everybody should really look hard at the First Amendment and think about it as instrumental. And so all the cases of the 60s where the ACLU is litigating the right to protest and, you know, the rights of civil rights marchers, et cetera, are all based on the First Amendment. And so it would have been very hard to have a civil rights movement without the backup of the First Amendment and being able to force, you know, places, especially in the South, but not only, to let people have demonstrations and to kind of not just say, you know, we don't want to hear that, you know, you're not allowed to talk. I was on the board for a while with a man called Anthony Griffin, who was a Black man who was the lawyer in Texas, and he represented the Klan in, you know, just one of, you know, it was just about speech, obviously not defending their ideas, but representing the Klan on the ground that, again, if you have government saying what people can say and what they can't say, that's just not a good situation, because then people are not hearing each other and deciding for themselves what can be said and how you should react. And so our feeling has always been, you know, if you can say the KKK can't have a rally, you can also, you know, more governments are going to say Black Lives Matter can't have a rally. They're too dangerous. They're people we don't want to hear from. So to me, I've talked a lot about this over my years at the ACLU, because there are a lot of people who say, well, you know, but you know, there are certain kinds of racist speech that just should not be permissible because it erases people, it makes people feel awful, it makes them feel excluded. And I think that you can't just say, the government can't say, you know, people aren't allowed to say that, because I think that's just too dangerous. And I think also that if you tell people not to say things, that doesn't mean they're going to stop thinking them and acting on them. They're just going to learn not to say them out loud. And those nasty ideas are going to fester. You know, the KKK wasn't allowed to have their demonstration, and they really make something out of that. Or the person who's told a racist joke on the campus is, you know, starts feeling, you know, I'm the victim, I'm wrapped in the First Amendment, pay attention to me, my rights have been violated. And I feel like the point of the ACLU, by having this whole range, 14 areas that we work in of civil rights and civil liberties, is that they have to all go together. And so you can't say we're going to choose between free speech and, you know, and a sense that people have of, you know, I don't want to hear these awful things that are being said. You have to go deeper and find better ways to do it. So what I've seen over the years in the school context, well, I'll give you actually a Ku Klux Klan example. So there was a parade that the Klan had, you know, 20 years ago, you know, 30 years ago, where there were people in New York who tried to stop them from marching. And that didn't work. So the Klan had, you know, their march. It was 47 very elderly, white, bedraggled people, you know, walking down Fifth Avenue, and lining the parade route with thousands of New York City residents with signs and, you know, protests, you know, about why they thought the Klan's ideas were stupid and wrong and evil. Okay, so to me, the question isn't really to whether or not you have that speech. The question is what you do with that speech. So at the university, you have, if you know, somebody is going to come on campus and say something that is really awful, so have a week of education about that. I heard of one Black woman who was a student at one college who said, you know, let me at these racists. You know, I want them to come and I want to answer them back. Just, you know, give me a debate, give me a chance to answer them. Okay, so Gail is also asking about case selection. That, Gail, thank you. That's also a very thing that we talk about a lot, because clearly we don't want to be the in-house counsel for the Klan, and most of our affiliates don't, they don't do that. It is actually very rare that we take a case like that. So one of the things that affiliates always ask themselves when they're deciding what cases to take is they ask themselves, is there somebody else who's going to represent this principle, if there's an important principle involved, or do we need to do this? And so the early history, the NAACP was there, and there are organizations that were there. There's this organization called FIRE, which is, they do a lot of campus speech stuff, and they're totally only on the First Amendment. They only care about that. And so they're going to be all over these cases. And so most affiliates feel, there's no need for them to take those cases. And also most of those cases do not make law. So it's actually not a very common thing that an ACLU affiliate will represent right-wing speakers. But Gail, after the Charlottesville demonstration, we had an organization-wide conversation about how to develop guidelines. And one of the factors that affiliates are asked to consider, is recommended that they consider in deciding whether or not to take a particular case, is how that case will affect their alliances with other community groups. Okay, so it's important consideration. And you're right, the case selection is also part of it. And in fact, we get criticized a lot from the people at FIRE and so forth, that we're not being sufficiently protective of the First Amendment, because we don't spend a lot of time representing the right-wing speakers at schools and et cetera. That's mostly where this is happening now at schools. And so, my feeling is probably if you're being criticized from both sides, maybe that means you have it about right. But it's a difficult conversation, because there are a lot of people within the ACLU, there are a lot of people on staff who feel very strongly that that they don't want the organization spending any resources at all. And the principle is fine, but how many resources you spend. So all I can say is that a lot of the ACLU is about process. The affiliates make their own decisions what cases to take. The board processes, what are our policies and how are we going to approach things. So that's a really important ongoing conversation.
So I have a question that it's following up on what you're already speaking about, and you're touching on it a little bit, and I think it's going to be kind of two-part. So my question is about affiliates and the case selection. So what is this affiliate structure as you describe it? And when it comes to case selection, what is the structure for that? So you spoke about it in general terms of, the thought behind taking certain cases, but as a practical matter, how does it come across your table to be decided? And then what is there, like a vote? Is there a meeting based on every case that comes down, and you decide, like, what is the process for case selection in
the kind of intake and case selection?
Yeah.
So what I was saying, Desiree, is that the ACLU has 54 affiliates, and those are essentially autonomous affiliates. So it's sort of like we have this federalist structure where the national ACLU has some policies, only a few policies that apply to affiliates, one of which is our DEI policy, how to be inclusive, and that they have to do that. There are a couple of other things, like you have to give people due process. You can't just go fire your executive director for no reason. And there are just a few things that are kind of non-negotiable, and everybody has to do that, or they can't call themselves the ACLU. But within that, the affiliates all make their own decisions, and those decisions are not appealable. It's like it's just like New York State makes its own decision, and the federal government can't say you can't do that. So the affiliates will have different intake procedures, often depending on how big they are. So some affiliates that have a pretty small staff will have a legal committee, and the lawyers will all sit down and decide, what kinds of cases do we want to take? How do we want to use our resources? Bigger affiliates will have people whose job is to do the intake and look at all the applications. All of the ACLU affiliates have many, many more applications or requests for assistance than they can possibly handle. And I can tell you that for sure, because for the past 12 years, I have been the complaint department. Yeah. The ACLU of Oklahoma didn't take my case, and it was the most important case there could be. So I'm complaining. You tell them to take my case. So my assistant would write this kind of standard letter to them all saying, well, they're an autonomous organization. I can't really, tell them what to do, and kind of, explain the whole thing and the process. So that does vary. And also the affiliates will have their own priorities. And I can tell you that right now, I think, again, the complaint that I've gotten is that the First Amendment is not that high a priority for most of the affiliates. There's work that they think is more important to do because, the First Amendment principles have been established. A city is not supposed to say to Black Lives Matter, you can't have a rally, we don't like what you're saying. And they're not supposed to say that to right wingers either. Again, a lot of better ways to deal with that. So why don't I think I have a few more slides here about the ACLU's racial justice work that I think might be interesting, and then we'll see if people want to talk about any of that. So one important person in the ACLU's work in this area, I'm sure a lot of you know Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. Well, before Michelle became an academic, she was a staff attorney at the ACLU of Northern California, where she was doing, and I think it was one of the first places in the country to be doing this, but she was doing racial justice work. And she really was all over the driving while Black or brown initiatives, and doing that as a matter of litigation. The ACLU has also done, there's a place on the web, a web page where you can say, have you had a problem, tell us what your problem was, and just you were collecting information, as well as deciding who to represent. So that was, one major initiative, was just, trying to work on that. So after the George Floyd murder, of course, all racial justice issues just all over the place really heated up. And so one role that the ACLU had was, actually, maybe I'll play you a minute of this, but to do that, I think I have to enable the share sound first. So here's Emerson Sykes, who's one of the chief ACLU First Amendment attorneys.
Here we are again. People have taken to the streets to show their pain, show their outrage, and demand justice. At the ACLU, we've been doing it for 100 years, trying to protect that right to protest, that right to call people in power.
Okay, so I'm just going to interrupt Emerson. You can find him if you want to hear the whole thing, but I don't think you need to hear the whole speech. But the idea is that one of the roles of the ACLU was to tell people what are your rights while demonstrating, especially in the pandemic. It was so complicated. Can they arrest you if you're not wearing a mask, or what's going on here? So that's become a very important role. And in fact, there's in Minnesota, which is everyone has their eyes on these days, there's been a class action lawsuit on behalf of the George Floyd protesters in affiliates around the country when people were having trouble in Oregon and just a lot of other places. One backup role that the ACLU was playing was really to try to defend the protesters and to try to make sure that the protesters didn't have their rights violated. If you looked at the website, you'll see there are a whole lot of other racial justice initiatives that we've had, including, advocating federal legislation, the Justice and Policing Act. But here's another place where I want to tell you that there's a whole lot to the when to lead and when to follow. So there are a number of, we don't have one position on defunding the police, or is police reform ever desirable as opposed to just abolish the police or whatever, because we have 54 affiliates. And there are different situations, and each affiliate has to make its own decision about how far to push and what's appropriate. We also have places where it's sometimes very difficult to have allies, because the allies can have different ideas. Even though everyone can agree on the problems, people may have different ideas about the solutions. So I'll give you one example. So in the ACLU of Illinois was litigating the stop and frisk policies of the police in Chicago. And that's something that was litigated in New York. And the New York Police Department was really required to cut way back on using stop and frisk as a tactic as a result of litigation. That was not mostly ACLU litigation, that was by the Center for Constitutional Rights. But the ACLU of Illinois was litigating with the Chicago Police Department to try to get them to cut back on stop and frisk policies. Well, I was hearing from the director there that there was one local organization that was really annoyed at the idea that the ACLU was asking the Chicago police to spend money on training their police. And what they said was, we don't want more polite police. We want that money to be used for after-school basketball leagues. And we want ways to kind of keep kids out of the hands of the police. Now, two different strategies, but the ACLU doesn't really have a tool for getting after-school basketball leagues. And you can go into court and claim that it's unconstitutional. So I think that over the past 10 years, I think the ACLU affiliates in a lot of different places have become a lot more sensitive to how to work with allies and how to really sit down in a room together and decide together what would be, what's an appropriate thing for the ACLU to do. So, well, maybe I don't need to show you those things now.
Yeah, and sorry, Professor Herman.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't know if you saw this last question, and you might.
It's hard to read the chat questions while I'm also talking.
Exactly. It's almost impossible. So this last question, in the chat is, can you talk about how the ACLU has been working with grassroots organizations on the racial justice issues? You might be getting some more of that, but.
Well, I think that's kind of just where I was coming from, of sitting down with the organizations in a place like Minneapolis or wherever else around the country. And a whole lot of groups, there are a lot of kind of summit conferences where a whole lot of groups will get together to talk about how do we want to handle this. And one of the things that I've heard ACLU lawyers say on webinars and all is, we don't want to be the lead here. We don't want to be setting the goals. We want to hear more from the other organizations about where they want to go. So I'll give you an example of a great thing that the ACLU of Minnesota is doing that really nobody else could do, that this is kind of a good role, is that so if you want to defund the police and have the money go elsewhere, it's a problem if in your city charter it says that a certain amount of money has to go to the police, right? So, you have to get that out of the way. So the ACLU of Minnesota is working on amending the Minneapolis city charter to get rid of that compulsion.
That's
okay, cool. And that's a great place for the experience of we've done initiatives, we know how to do those kinds of things, right? So there's an example of you kind of sit down around the table and you talk through with a bunch of organizations and allies of what's the goal here and what are some strategies for getting there, and then you figure out who can do what. And so, there's going to be a different story at every affiliate about exactly who's doing what. So part of it is the, in some places, I think that lobbying for the federal legislation is something. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act would do some things. It would get rid of the qualified immunity defense so that people could bring actions against the police in federal court, and things like that. So that's a good thing to do. But I think that, you get 100 people working on a situation and you're going to have at least, 57 different ideas about the best way to approach things. So I think, again, it's just all a process.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think I want to kind of show you one more kind of thing, and then you will just see what general questions people have or whether you just want to talk in general. So I want to tell you about, actually, I forgot to do the sound thing, so let me do this again.
So Professor Herman, while you get that set up, just for the attendees, I want to share something towards the end. We do want to make this a little more interactive, which is part of why we went meeting style. So if you're comfortable, feel free to turn on your cameras. We're going to have a question or two for the audience as part of this next segment, and so would love to engage with everyone a bit further.
Yeah, thank you, Carl, for that. So I want to tell you a little story. So I was recently speaking to a group of New York City high school students at one of these interesting schools. It was the Urban Makers Assembly Academy. And before I spoke, the students were invited to send me a list of questions that they had in advance. And one of the questions that I got, I just thought was wonderful. I'd never heard a question like this before. A young man named Marlon asked me the question, what song represents freedom to you? Okay, so as Carl was saying, I want you all to be thinking, I'm going to tell you what my answer was. I'm going to show you what my answer was. But then I'm going to invite you to think about what song would represent freedom to you. So here was my answer. This is what I played for Marlon.
Paul and Silas bound to jail, had no money for to go their bail. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. Paul and Silas began to shout. Jail door open and then he walked out. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. Hey, hold on, hold on, hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the
I played that for these high school students, and isn't it wonderful? So, Marlon liked it. And so what was interesting to me, I asked, had he ever heard Eyes on the Prize before? And he said no, he actually hadn't heard of it. So I explained to him that the reason that I chose that song was that I was talking about, defending civil rights and civil liberties. And that to me, that song represents freedom, because freedom doesn't just happen by itself any more than diversity in organizations just happens by itself. And to me, that song is a symbol of the work and the pain and the risk behind working for freedom. Right, so that I associate that with the civil rights marchers, marching along and subjecting themselves to fire hoses and dogs, and it's such determination about doing the work, whatever work you need to do, no matter what the cost, in order to achieve freedom. And so I was asking the students what they knew about the civil rights movement, and their answer was, well, they thought they had maybe studied it in history. And they talked about it as if it was like studying the Habsburg Empire. And so what was so staggering to me was that, that this was history that they did not know. So so the question, Carl was saying we have some questions for you. People are doing a great job in the chat of answering what's your favorite song that represents freedom to you. And we have Redemption Song. And we have.
Which is my song also.
That's yours?
It would be my choice, yeah.
That would be your choice. And
you change something, Carl.
Yeah.
I knew you'd notice that.
And Stand Up. And the Sam Cooke. Did anybody see that film that was just on Netflix with the One Night in Miami where Sam?
Yeah.
No, yeah.
No.
Yeah. Anyway, that's just a sideline. Okay, so the song.
Hi, this is finally Gail. I am going to come on in a minute with all my questions, but my song is really a strong song. My song is James Brown. I don't want nobody to give me nothing. I open up the door and I'll get it myself. I'm an old civil rights lawyer as well. And the great film to see, for those who haven't seen it, is Raoul Peck's HBO on-demand series, Exterminate the Brutes. And it's the kind of piece that when young kids, Black kids in particular, don't know civil rights law, it's kind of what Einstein would say, which is that racism is a white man's problem. And so these kinds of movies and stories should be watched more by whites than by the victims of racism in this country. I urge everybody to watch the film. It's very upsetting. If you drink, you might need a glass of wine or a shot of bourbon next to you, because it is a very powerful piece that looks at the issues of race in this country and in this nation. And yes, I do know Eleanor Holmes Norton and the history behind why she took on that case. So I'm being kind of unfair. I'm being kind of a titillator, if you will, but I appreciate all of your comments and appreciate this moment. Thank you, everybody, for letting me speak. And I will show my face as soon as I comb my hair.
Gail, we appreciate it. Yeah, it educates us, right? And so you bringing that up gives us more information.
I'll also say to you, Gail, that I've spoken many places to many different kinds of audiences, and I actually prefer not just speaking to the choir of every, the ACLU supporters who, don't have any challenges or questions. I pretty recently, before the pandemic, I gave a talk at the Central Arkansas Library where it was for the public. And so I wanted not only the choir to come, the ACLU choir, so I called it A Republican and a Democrat Walk into a Bar.
Yeah, that'll do it.
And the question, what did they have to say to each other? And I wanted to talk about that. And there were Republicans there and there were people pushing back. And I think it's great because I feel like if we can't talk about what our fundamental values are and freedom and equality and what we mean by that, then, what hope do we have? So I think before Gail, you come back and before we have more discussion, I do one more thought about the song that I played for Marlon. So this is a quote from Deborah Archer, our new president. She says, "Younger folks engaged in this movement don't feel constrained by the losses of the past, and they have imagination beyond belief. I think we can do ourselves a service by following their lead because they are fearless, they are creative, and they are not deterred by the past." So I really like that as a kind of a last thought on how to lead and how to follow. So, Marlon already taught me that, what song represents freedom to you is a great question. But I feel like that whole question of, to what extent, what Gail, you were just saying is that, we don't need to tell Marlon to watch this film. What is he going to make of the history? Is it white people who need to see it more? But I do have questions about, how we build on that history and what we do want to teach, Marlon and the other kids, what's useful to the history of them, and to what extent are we constrained by our history and really kind of need to get past our history in order to make progress. And Gail, I've written down exterminate the brutes going on my list.
Yes, I put it in the chat and I hope everybody will see it. It's kind of the part of truth that comes with reconciliation. It's the truth part. And really until this nation and the world, in fact, reckons with who has done what to whom and when, the conversation to talk to the victims of whether you're Native American or Asian or Black, to talk to the victims about that in some ways is, we saw the pain. We didn't see the pain, but we're feeling it now. Whether you're watching the Floyd trial or whether you're just walking down the street as a Black man and see a police and get afraid. So it's about white people understanding this history, white people understanding it not just from a historical perspective, but in a way that looks at the behaviors that come into play right now. And we can look at the law, we can look at all the professions, we can look at housing, we can look at everything within our society, and that's just within the United States, but we can look at it around the world and see this notion of exterminate the brutes. I don't want to, the movie is really fantastic. It's challenging, and I think it challenges all of us. And I would agree with you that all of us are challenged, but I have big questions for white America that really needs to reckon with its history, back starting with the founders of the Declaration of Independence. I could never call them my founding father, because my folks were definitely expressly excluded from the Declaration. There was a provision that was going to be put in by Thomas Jefferson, and it was taken out. It was going to say to King George, why do you put these people, make them slaves? They've done nothing to us. And that was taken out because South Carolina, don't let me go on. South Carolina and Georgia said, no, no, no. And there was one northern state that said the same thing, because the North was complicit in all of this in terms of needing the goods from the South in order to become manufacturing places that they were, as in Boston, et cetera, in Massachusetts. So, really reckoning with it, I think is if we can't realize the significance of doing it right now, which is why I'm being so candid and frank, then I don't know if we ever will. I think we have an opportunity right now to be more sensitive, not sensitive in an emotional way, but in a way that allows us to see why things are the way they are. Why? How did we get here? How do we get here?
Yeah, so I think, what you're saying, I think you're absolutely right that this is a moment now, and that it's time for a real reckoning. And one question is just on a very deep level of how you reckon. I would love to know what you all think about, Congress has just set up a commission, the House has set up a commission to study the possibility of reparations. And so that's, the deep, how do we deal with our entire history is a really deep long-term project, which I agree now is the moment. If we can't talk about this now, when? But in the meantime, one reason that I like Marlon's question about what song represents freedom to you is that when I've spoken to New York City high school students in the past, the most common question that I get is, can the police do that? And every day they're being hassled by the police. And it's not going to help Marlon and his friends if we have deep conversations about reparations. So I think the immediate question of what do you do about policing? And do you say, well, we don't want police reform because we're going for the whole thing? What about Marlon? What about the high school kids now? Who are not going to benefit in any way. So I think there are a lot of very difficult questions, both about the deep conversations we need to have and how to reckon with our past, but there are also questions about how to do your work in the present that is going to just be helpful to get more people, justice and equality.
Well, Professor, make me think about, I think addressing that immediate issue for someone like Marlon then helps turn him into someone who can help deal with the deeper reckoning. So if his issues with the police are immediately addressed, we can then tie him and bring him in to fighting the larger cause and addressing, the deeper seated issues that go back much further and deeper beyond just the police are harassing me or harassing him every day. And so the question also about is history a constraint makes me think about the fact that many leaders of the civil rights movement were young. right? And so they were in a different space, but maybe in this generation, not having such a connection to history gives more hope, right? And I think we've become a more tolerant society as a result of this younger generation that does not have that knowledge of the history of the past, right? And so they're coming in, and that everyone should, of course, be equal, because why not? Because they don't have any understanding of anything else.
Yeah. And so I think too, what you were saying, Carl, is I think right. And to me, I want to draw the connection between the stop and frisk practices and the rise of policing and slavery and the slave catchers and all. And yeah, I don't know whether that's a thing that Marlon and his come to, whether they need to know the history to know that, or if they just need to stop being hassled by the police.
Yeah.
So there was a question that's come up in the chat about what organizations to volunteer for if you want to be doing work that would be helpful in these areas. So I can tell you the ACLU has a great arm now that's called People Power, which is community organizing. And we've done projects on voting rights. We've done projects on immigration and on having volunteers all over the country who talk to different leaders of cities and towns to try to get them to be sanctuary cities. I think they're planning a racial justice initiative that could involve just volunteers, where you just kind of get trained and help. So you can keep an eye on People Power. But other than that, I was talking with Desiree and Carl yesterday when we were thinking about this, about how you find allies, how you find coalitions, how you find organizations. And Deborah said, what organization is good to volunteer for? So in addition to the ACLU or the NYCLU, what do you all think? Are there organizations that you have identified or that you found that you think are good to be involved with?
So you're saying outside of the organizations you're just mentioning, are there other organizations that you think would be good organizations to work with in that regard, in regards to the question?
Well, I think that was Deborah's question. She asked what organizations you're good to volunteer for if you want to do civil rights work. So I think one question is, do people, are there organizations that people have an eye on? And how do you kind of hook yourself up? And I think there are also questions about what you can do as a lawyer. So, there are people who are, their day job is doing civil rights, but then there are people who have a day job doing something that's not that, who want to really amplify. So I think one thing that you can do is do your pro bono commitment, just find an organization that you like. But I think another way to work, and you guys are all part of this, is to work through bar associations.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually making sure I was clear before I just started shamelessly plugging ABWA, but because we have a committee.
And MBBA.
Of course. I was like, let me make sure I'm answering the right question before I look like I'm just out here plugging. Yeah, but our organizations, and I think just like we were talking about earlier with the coalition building and working together, that's how these two organizations came together to form this amazing program tonight. And in particular, I chair the Legislative and Civil Rights Committee for ABWA. And so we put on a number of events. This year alone, we've done a voting rights educational program to show, with everything that was going on with the protests, we were educating about what your rights actually are, despite what's been changing, and what's on the ballot. And then we do encourage people to run for office. And we have one with the ranked choice voting. We want to educate about how that's going to work, so everybody understands the true ramifications of that. So I think there are ways, and of course, MBBA has a ton of sections that work to those same mission and value. And so I think the bar associations, even if it's not in court or doing, an amicus brief, any litigation, there's still ways that you can volunteer, use your expertise or just your opinions or network to try to advance the cause in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I see in the chat, Lanier said National Action Network.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so maybe there's one answer. You're there. Do it through these organizations.
Yeah. Start one. No, just kidding. That's a lot of work. but
So does anybody have any other questions you want to talk about? Or thoughts? Well, Desiree and Carl, if nobody has any more questions, one thing that we could do. Oh, okay. Here are some questions here.
That's a good one.
Always have to give people, some more time to think.
yeah.
So I'm to ask, what do you see for the future of the ACLU?
Okay, the future of the ACLU. Okay, so one thing that people were asking is, with Deborah in charge, do things get different? And I think that where the ACLU is focusing now, there were kind of some top focuses in the past few years. We've had to do a lot of work about immigrants' rights. And I think the racial justice initiative is going to be something that's going to be more central, because there is enough to do at this point that you don't have to worry that you're kind of out shouting the NAACP anymore. There's plenty for everybody to do. The future of the ACLU. So one of the things over the past is that in addition to the staff and the board becoming more diverse and more inclusive, the work of the ACLU has also become greatly expanded. So going from a few areas in 1920, like the First Amendment and the due process and immigrants' rights, et cetera, and the racial justice work, we now have projects for, first LGBT rights. That was something that, took a while for even the ACLU to do, although we had cases as early as the 30s that were about discrimination in that area. We have a human rights program that deals with international treaties and all. We don't work outside the United States, but we do work to use international human rights treaties and compacts in our work about rights within the United States. So it's been a growth process. We also have a lot of lawyers who are working on technology and what a difference that makes. So it's been a constant expansion of having more and more areas that sometimes people would drag their feet a little and say, well, why should family rights be or sex be a civil liberty as opposed to just political things? But we're very inclusive. So the main possible growing edge I think we've had right now, something we've been talking about for years, is socioeconomic justice. So the Constitution is really basically negative. It's about what the government can't do to you. The stop and frisk practices, they can't prosecute you for for dissenting speech. But what the Constitution mostly does not really do is to say what the government needs to do for you. Like during the pandemic, Congress came up with little help for people who needed some help. Well, there's no constitutional obligation for them to help. So the ACLU has been getting closer to supporting the Health Care Act, Obamacare, because it has such a major impact on people with disabilities and on reproductive freedom. But we haven't really just been a kind of a social justice organization in that way, arguing that the government does have responsibilities to people in addition to the responsibility to not do things to you. And I think that might be a conversation that's coming. The connection between the affirmative obligations of government. If you look at constitutions other than ours, South Africa has an amazing constitution that talks about the government's obligation to help you have housing and help. And one of my favorite things, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is something that Eleanor Roosevelt really worked on and kind of came into being partially because of her. There are all these countries that have signed on to it, and almost nobody in the United States has heard of it. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights declares affirmative obligations of government in all sorts of ways, and talks about great things that the Roosevelts, both Eleanor and Franklin, thought were the next phase of like the four freedoms idea, that it was the next phase after our constitutional rights to have everybody should have the right to dignity and the right to a clean environment and healthcare and housing and education and things that are not in the Constitution. So I think that could be a real growing edge in terms of the future of the ACLU. The other thing I think is that we have, in the Trump years, the ACLU quadrupled in size in terms of the membership and the people who were supporting what we were doing, because it was just all hands on deck. It was just such an emergency, given that I say that the ACLU works in 14 areas of civil rights and civil liberties, and so did the Trump administration, just from the opposite side.
Mhm.
So I think now that Biden is in office, it's not that there's a lot less work to do, because things that are happening in the states are really pretty horrifying. We saw what just happened in Georgia about voting rights, right? Our executive director in Georgia, Andrea Young, is the daughter of Andrew Young, and she actually came to work for the ACLU because she wanted to work on voting rights. So she is the right person to have in place if there's any fighting back to be done. She's in the right place. But, so the states all have horrible, they're horrible about reproductive freedom and immigrants' rights and all sorts of things. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we're anticipating that a lot of people will not have the sense of urgency that they had during the Trump administration, and feel like, oh, Biden is president now, what's the problem?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's still going to be problems. I think the ACLU has sued every president in our 101 years. They'll sue Biden over something. It's just a matter of time.
It's nonpartisan, right? So before we conclude, both Professor Herman and Desiree brought up voting rights, so I just want to plug MBBA is along with Rank the Vote New York on May 6th is having a presentation and mock election related to ranked choice voting, which with our primaries coming up in June will be in place. And so look out for more information on that. On behalf of ABWA and MBBA, Professor Herman, we'd like to thank you so much, not only for an amazing presentation, but for your service on behalf of pushing civil rights and civil liberties for the ACLU as its 7th president. Otherwise, your tenure in service as now Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a professor at Brooklyn Law School. I'm not a Brooklyn Law alum, but I'm a Brooklynite, and so I appreciate the connection. We truly do appreciate you. And so I'd ask all of our attendees to join me in thanking Professor Herman for such a wonderful presentation and talk.
Woo! Thank you, Professor Herman.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Desiree, and thank you for being here, everybody else. And thank you for your work. I think it's great that you're having programs and doing the work that Desiree was describing. So keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
Yes. Oh, I love that. That was nice.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.
Bye.
Take
Bye-bye.
care and be well.
And Desiree, stay in touch.
Yes, I will.
We'll have to grab you again in the near future, Professor Herman.
Be delighted. Happy to be grabbed. Very nice to meet you, Carl. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, my pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.